Hey everyone, welcome back. So today is going to be a little different. It's going to be a little bit of a story time because I was watching a show. I love to watch the Behavior Panel. It's a YouTube channel. And Scott Rouse, I caught a video of his and he was talking about the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath, narcissists, and all of that. And that got me thinking back to when I worked for a narcissistic psychopath. And I thought, what a great story. What a great story that would be to tell you. So today I'm going to tell you about that story. This story starts probably 25 years ago. Maybe a little bit, maybe 28 years ago, when I was still married. And I'm going to change the names and some identifying features here, though it was a long time ago, and this is my experience, and I feel okay talking about it. But yeah, it goes back about that far. And I was working at the time for a company, a service company. And I started at that company in the accounting department for the first 5 years I worked there. In the last 5 years I worked there, I was the executive assistant to the president. And I have nicknamed him the Devil. If you know me in person, you know that that's how I refer to him. But we're going to call him Franklin for our purposes. That is not his name, but we're going to call him Franklin. And what was so interesting about this person is that, he was a friend of my ex-husband's. They worked in the same industry, and they were friendly, not good friends. It's not like he ever came to our house or anything like that. But when I first started working for him, I didn't know what he was really like. It was only when I was going through my divorce and afterwards that I really got to know him, because that's when I became his executive assistant. So I had been working for the company for a couple of years, and I could see that I was going to need to be able to support myself and make more money. And he had already been through, a handful of executive assistants that just could not somehow stay in that position. Of course, I didn't know why. And so I approached him to say, why don't I give it a try? Could I give it a try? That sort of thing. And the thing about a narcissist, and I didn't realize that Franklin was a narcissist at this time, is that narcissists, and psychopaths can be extremely charming. In fact, if you met one and you weren't in a relationship with them, whether it's a work relationship or a personal relationship, you would like them. Absolutely. And that's the interesting thing. So as Scott Rouse says on the Behavior Panel, he says, and I totally agree with this, that all psychopaths are narcissists, but not all narcissists are psychopaths. And just to sort of clarify, and again, I'm not an expert, this is just my experience and the research that I've done afterwards, because it was fascinating once I had time to recover, is that the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath is interesting. And in general terms, psychopaths are born and sociopaths are made. Their circumstances, the way they were brought up, the things that they went through make them that. Whereas a psychopath is born without the ability to have empathy and to care about people. They understand what they're doing. They just don't care. They just weren't born with that. Whereas a sociopath can feel connection, can feel empathy and sympathy for other people. The things that have happened to them in the past or the situations that they're in, they can choose to ignore that, but they have the ability to have those emotions, if that makes sense. So it's important to know that, right? And I read somewhere something really interesting. They were about how a psychopath's mind works. Psychopaths also tend to, when they get angry, they get really quiet and intense, whereas sociopaths in general will have outbursts and be loud and aggressive. A psychopath is different than a sociopath in that way. That's when they get really scary, because they get really quiet and intense. They tend not to be overt with their aggression. They can be aggressive, but they tend to be, it's when they get really quiet and intense that you got to worry. So that was interesting. So the way I describe it, and I read this description and I think it's brilliant, is that a psychopath and a narcissist, because again, all psychopaths are narcissists and they have a lot of common traits. Let's just say that they're on their way from their apartment to the corner store to get a pop. And on the way to that corner store to get that pop, they come across an accident. And they'll stand there and they'll look at everybody around and they'll see how people are reacting. And they'll see people, reacting in fear and in anger or in, absolute sorrow, right? They'll watch people's expressions and their emotions and how it looks on their faces. And they'll go, they'll study that and they'll go, that's what sadness looks like. So that's what loss looks like. That's what empathy looks like. That's what, caring looks like. And they'll just take that in. And then they'll continue on their way to get the pop and go home. Because a psychopath and a narcissist, they don't actually feel those emotions, but they're really good at pretending to feel those emotions and to make people do what they want to do. And so the next time there's a situation where they have to call up sorrow or empathy or caring or any of those things, they'll go back in their memory to that moment and they'll go, that's what that's supposed to look like. So that's what I'll put on. And that's how I will act. It's important to know that, because a narcissist, they don't actually feel those emotions, but they do a really good impersonation of somebody who does give a shit, who does care about other people when it suits them. Because a narcissist will use people for their own goals, right? They love, in my case, Franklin, loved money and used people and was very good at making people admire him, like him, love him, I guess, right? Very good at that. But never actually felt those things for other people. And that was really quite interesting. And I didn't know this when I started working for him as his executive assistant, because up until that point, I was just an employee, the wife of an acquaintance, and there was no bond between us, and I wasn't useful to him in any way other than as an employee who worked in a whole different department on a different floor. But when I started working for him as his executive assistant, that's when I got to see what a narcissist is like. And it was fascinating and traumatic, as I'm sure you can imagine. And I'm going to tell you some stories that you're not going to believe, but I swear are real. If you have ever seen the movie The Devil Wears Prada, you will know that, what's her name? Not Glenn Close. Hold on, I got to figure out what her name is. Meryl Streep. That's who it is. So Anne Hathaway is the assistant, and Meryl Streep is the main character, and she is horrible. Now, a perfect example of a narcissist and a psychopath, if ever I saw one, because someone who could be extremely charming and people admired, but who actually had zero sympathy, empathy, caring for anybody else but herself, and only cared about people in the way that they could use them. So some of the things that I saw or in that movie, that I heard her say in that movie, were actually things that were almost identical to things that I experienced. Keep in mind that when I started working for Franklin as his executive assistant, I had just become a single mother. And I had 2 young kids, 10 and 3 at home, 10 and 4. And so one of the things that narcissists like to do, need to do, is to keep the people around them off balance, right? They need to make them dependent on them, and then they need to make sure that they never feel secure, that they're always off balance. And he was very good at doing that. Now, I will say he paid me very well. But again, that was to keep me needing to be there, and dependent on him. And so I would be at work by 7. I often wouldn't leave until 7. I had a friend of mine who would come and babysit the kids after work. They had before school care, but she would come and pick them up from after school care and daycare, and would stay with them and feed them dinner until I got home. I remember one time it was the weekend, and Franklin was away. He had traveled somewhere, and he had missed his flight. And so this was Sunday, and I was at IKEA, and I had both kids with me, and I was in the bathroom at IKEA. I had a BlackBerry at the time, and I had to have that sucker on 24/7. It always had to be with me, and it always had to be on, and I always had to answer it. And so I answered this call from a grown-ass man at the time in his mid-40s. And he's in somewhere, I don't know where, Atlanta somewhere, and he's missed his flight, and he needs me to get him another flight. He's at the airport. He could walk over to the counter of the airline, but instead he phoned me in Calgary to get him another flight. And I'm trying to explain to him that I'm not at the office. It's Sunday. I'm at IKEA with the kids. Nope. I had to take the kids home and log on and get him another flight home. And it's a perfect example of what a narcissist does, because it's a power thing, right? He could have taken care of that for himself, but it was more satisfying. It brought him more pleasure knowing that he could force me, because I wanted to keep my job, and remember, I'm a single parent and I need that job, to bend to his will and have to do that, right? And again, he could have done that himself. Any other grown-ass man would have done that himself, but not Franklin. So that's just one example. He would be the kind of person who would tell you what to do, like give you instructions on something. You would do it that way, and then there was a 50-50 chance that he would go, that's not how I told you to do it, right? I didn't tell you to do that. Why did you do that, right? Again, to keep you off balance. So you were always second-guessing yourself. You were always in that feeling of fight or flight at all times. The controller that we had was an accountant of many years, and her and the other managers would come to me on the side and say, hey, I got to talk to Franklin about this, or I've just done this report, or I just have, is this what he wants? What do you think I should say? How do you think I should say it? Because my office was right next to his. There was an open door between the two of us. We spent all of our time together. I was constantly booking his meetings, getting him ready for his meetings, booking his travel, doing the company events, that sort of thing. And so I would be that first step for these managers to figure out how to approach him, and if he gave them directions, it wouldn't be uncommon for them to come to me when he wasn't around and say, what do you think he means there? Because he was cryptic on purpose, again, to keep people off balance. I remember one time him telling me that he had made every manager, almost every employee that worked directly with him cry at one point, at some point, male or female. And he was proud of that, which still gives me a sick feeling. So I remember one time It was the middle of winter and it was a snowstorm. It was Friday, and I had, he was at the university doing this sort of PhD thing. It wasn't really a PhD. I had done most of the work for this course for him for his presentation, and that was the day that they were doing his presentation. So he was there, and it was a big snowstorm. And so I shut down my computer at 5 o'clock. I hadn't heard from him. I had messaged him a couple of times, and I hadn't heard from him. So I wanted to get home, and I knew that the roads were going to be horrible. So I sent him a final message saying, hey, I'm shutting down. I'm heading home. You know, I hope your presentation went well. And I shut down my computer, and I got in my car, and I started driving home. I was stuck in traffic under an overpass, trying to get home like everybody else in that city. We were not moving. And I get a phone call from him. And he's stuck. He's driven his car. He had a Mercedes or something like that that I used to have to get the tires changed on and take in for servicing and drive him and pick him up with whenever he went to meetings, because God forbid he should drive himself or do that stuff himself. And he calls me to say that he's stuck. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry, Franklin. I'm literally in the middle of traffic. I can't get to a computer because he wanted me to get a tow truck. And I don't have access I can't help you. I said, can you call your wife? And he said to me, and I quote, I'm standing here in the middle of a fucking snowbank. Do I have an assistant or not? So I said, well, okay, as soon as I can pull over, I will call around. And he hung up on me. And so took me about 15 minutes before we could crawl out of there and I could pull off. And the first thing I did was call his wife to ask, could she give me the number of some tow trucks? And she's like, yeah, he's already been on the phone to me. I've called every tow truck. They're not going to be able to get to him. Well, they don't know when they'll be able to get to him. So I ended up calling him back and saying, this is what's the situation. And he said, yeah, I know. And he just hung up on me. So again, a grown-ass man who's calling a woman who's stuck in traffic, and he doesn't care if I'm safe. He can't figure this out himself, or he can, but refuses to. But he wants me to do that. Just another example of the situation that I found myself in. I mean, I used to drive him to meetings, and I remember this one day when he was on the phone and he had a lunch, and I would normally drive him. So he's on the phone in his office. I put a note right in front of him on his keyboard, because he's facing it, saying, I'm going to bring the car around. And so then I went to do that, because if I hadn't done that and he'd hung up, he'd be like, we're going to be late. Why haven't you brought the car around? So I brought the car around, and I'm sitting in the car, and he eventually comes out and he gets in the passenger seat and he starts to yell at me. He didn't know where I was. And I said, well, I left you a note. And he goes, well, that's not how we do business, with notes. And he's yelling at me as I'm driving. And I'm picturing just stopping at this next red light, putting the car in park, and getting out and walking away. Because there's this grown-ass man, my boss, who is having a meltdown because of something so stupid. I needed that job. He paid me very well. I also had a company vehicle, again, to keep you, sort of having to stick around, right? After a situation like that, the next couple of days, he would be so nice and so charming, never apologize, never acknowledge anything like that. And that was how he operated. There's so many stories like that of working for him. Like when you did a report for him, when I did anything for him, it had to be perfect, and to the highest standard. And I will admit that I credit the reason that I have the high skills that I have today with how I write and how I communicate, how careful I am when I communicate via email or any kind of report that I'm doing. I credit it to having worked for Franklin, because if it wasn't at that level, I mean, it would be like the end of the world. I think the only emotion he could feel was pleasure in torturing people and keeping people off balance and playing those mind games. And that's the thing with somebody like that. When he was mad at you, he would get really quiet, really intense. He didn't yell usually, but when he was angry, he would just laser focus on you, and you would be like a bug, right? That in a spotlight and about to get squished. I ended up getting sick. I had a cancer scare. The doctor told me that it was absolutely related to stress, and that I needed to reduce stress in my life in order for this to not happen again, and next time be actually that. And I remember thinking to myself, how am I going to reduce stress? I have 2 young kids at home. I've got this job with this boss that is brutal. And I couldn't talk to anybody about it, because you're not allowed to talk about how bad it is, because he'll find out and that will be bad. And I needed that job. I needed that income in order to be able to support myself and the kids. It was after that incident in the car that I had a moment where I realized, if I don't leave this situation, I will get sick again, and it will be something that will be really bad. And I had to find a way to make that happen. So it was during this time that I watched the documentary, The Secret, or I don't know if it's a documentary, the show, The Secret. And there was one point in that show that made all the difference for me, that started me on the road to escaping this situation, because I really did feel like I was trapped. I feel like I had no options, right? Where else was I going to get paid this much and have the benefits? Because there was a lot of benefits to working at this company for this person. And it was Jack Canfield in that show. And he says something, and I'm paraphrasing, but I think I got it pretty right. He says, most people never allow themselves to want what they really want because they just can't imagine how it could ever happen. And that just hit me right here. I still get goosebumps when I think about that moment, because that was exactly it. I never allowed myself to imagine escaping this situation. I know it sounds weird because it was just a job. I never could let myself imagine not being there, because I just couldn't see how I could make that happen. And in The Secret, they talk a lot about how the how is not your job. If you're going to manifest things in your life, and this is why I think I'm pretty good at manifesting things, and have been able to make reach the goals and make the dreams come true that I have since this situation. The reason I am is because of this. What they say in that is that in order to manifest, you have to be so clear on the what. You have to live it as if you're living it today. You're not imagining this, thinking about it as if in the future I will. It's like, I am living this life, and this is what I am doing each day, and this is what my world does look like, and these are what my relationships are like. And at first you feel like a fraud, but you just practice and practice and practice. And that's what I did. I imagined exactly what my life was going to be like. And every time that thought would creep in, like, yeah, right. Like, how are you going to make that happen? How are you ever going to escape this? I just push it out and push it out and push it out. And it took me about almost a year from when I first started, realized I had to when I left. Long time. But I had to get a lot of things in place, right? I needed to get financial things in place, and I also needed to get my head in place, and I had some healing physically to do too, because I wasn't well. But it took that long for me to hand my letter of resignation in. course, I couldn't tell him I was leaving because of him. I said I was leaving because, I was, the hours were too much for me with the 2 kids. I had some health issues, and so I needed a job that was, less stressful, that sort of thing. And I wanted to go back to school. And he flat out told me, that people that do that sort of thing, they never really land on their feet after that, right? They leave a good situation thinking that they're going to do something else, and they never really do. Again, just to try and mess with my mind. And I asked him for a letter of recommendation, and he would not give it to me. He kept saying he would, and then if I would ask him, he'd get annoyed. He eventually did give me one, and it was a good one. A narcissist, a psychopathic narcissist, is so good at playing those mind games and convincing you that you cannot survive without them, and that something horrible is going to happen if they're displeased with you. I didn't even have a job to go to when I left that job because I was too afraid that he would find out that I was applying for other jobs. And so I left that job and I did temp work until I found a job, which took me about 4 or 5 months. So not that long. But what I realized after I left was that I had a form of PTSD because working for somebody so abusive who has played with your mind for so long and taken pleasure in it was affected me for years and still does to this day. It changes who you are. I remember when I got my next job, and ended up working for Calgary Economic Development for an amazing lady. Hi, Karen, if you ever watch my videos. And she was amazing. So that was my next real job. I did a few things in between. And I had several moments there where she said something or something happened and I had a panic attack. Like I just defaulted to expecting my new boss to react like the devil, like Franklin. And, we had to have some really good talks because I overreacted to things because of my default was I was going to get in trouble. This person was going to treat me badly, even though intellectually I knew she wasn't going to do that. Emotionally, that it triggered me. And I would just have these panic reactions. Even though it wasn't real, it was very real to me, right? If I had made a mistake, and still to this day, I have that reaction, though now I manage it. And expecting her to behave that way. And because intellectually I knew that normal people didn't behave that way, but I had spent so much time working so closely with somebody who had what's the word? Not trained, but they're really good at manipulating people. I guess training them, that's not the right word. Grooming people to sort of expect to be treated badly and put up with being treated badly. And again, I know it sounds weird because it's just a job, but you really have to remember the position I was in. I had just gone through a divorce, or was going through a divorce when I started working for him. And I was in a very vulnerable place. And he knew it and took advantage of it and made me so dependent on him and kept me so off balance that I didn't know whether to shit or go blind, as my father-in-law likes to say, old Nova Scotia saying. And so after years of that, I was so programmed to respond in a certain way. And when I started working for somebody who didn't treat their employees like that, didn't treat their assistants like that, it was such a shift, and this recovery phase was so intense for me. I should have been in therapy, but I wasn't at the time because I didn't realize I needed it. And only hindsight, only time and perspective can let you sort of understand that. I didn't realize I needed therapy when I really needed it. That new job, that new boss, Karen was amazing. And I was able to finally not live in a place of constant anxiety and fight or flight and panic. As recently as a year and a half ago, I worked with well, I'll call it a client. In my job, it's slightly different, and this person, definitely a narcissist, the kind of person that would tell you something and then say they didn't tell you that, and constantly sort of said, made you second guess, did I make a mistake? That sort of thing. And I had to tell my boss that I couldn't work with this person again, and explain why. Because working for that, it wasn't for, I provide a service to professionals. Try not to say what I do. And so I think of those professionals and their clients as my clients. And so I had to tell my boss that I could not work for that person again, because it was too triggering and I couldn't sleep at night. And I was having those feelings of anxiety again. And not because I was letting them get away with it. At this point in my life, I am well aware of what a narcissist and a psychopath are like. And as soon as I start working with them, I can spot them a mile away. And I no longer allow that in my world. But this is, professionally, sometimes you don't have a choice. And so working with this person, I was able to really push back and say, yeah, this is not going to happen. Of course, they didn't like that. And there was some of this. And I managed to get that project done. But then say to my boss, I can never work with this person again, ever. I will take 5 other projects, but I cannot work with this person. And I explained to her my background, my history, and why. And my boss, being an amazing boss, said to me, you don't have to say anymore. You'll never have to work with that person again. That's just fine. And it's never come up again. That's never been held against me. It's just never been mentioned again. And one of the reasons I love my company so much is because of that sort of thing, right? That my boss would listen, hear, and say, and then respond in that way. But every once in a while, I will come across somebody like that again, and it is amazing, even after all these years, even after 20 years, how it can rush me right back to those emotions and those feelings, and that PTSD. It's the only way I can describe it. Obviously, I've not been diagnosed with it, but from everything I've read, that's what it is. I just get that flashback right to it. I feel all of those emotions again. I have that panic attack. If you've seen that scene in Devil Wears Prada where she has Anne Hathaway running around getting that steak, and then she brings it in and she says, I don't want that, I'm going out to lunch. I had that experience almost identically. It wasn't a steak, it was a sandwich, and I went all over town to get this stupid thing, and because it wasn't lunchtime yet. And then they didn't want it. Franklin didn't want it, and he just left. When I saw that movie, I just thought to myself, yeah, I totally get it. People don't understand. They think that's a dramatization, that people like that don't exist. They do. And if you have somebody like that in your life, I feel for you. I know how difficult it is to get out of a situation like that, whether it is professional or personal. It's certainly, I think, going to be a lot harder if it's a personal relationship, family relationship, a partner or something like that. But even in a professional relationship, it can be incredibly difficult to get out of a situation like that. And it took me, I am not kidding, almost a year from the point I made the decision I had to leave for my own health to when I finally did. It's that difficult. I look back and I think, I'm a intelligent person. I'm a strong person. But those people, they catch you when you're at the most vulnerable, and then they exploit that. And they do it because they don't feel empathy. They don't feel sympathy. They don't actually care about anybody else. The only thing they care about is how other people can serve them, and they take perverse joy in the misery that they bring on to other people, that they cause other people. But from the outside, you would never have guessed, because this is somebody that was super well respected in the industry, that everybody thought was funny and charming and handsome and just an amazing person, until they started working for him. All right. That's all I got to talk about. I know it's a kind of a weird video today, but I just had this really big calling. I don't know what it is. This feeling that I should be sharing this, because there's somebody out there, one of you out there, needs to hear this today, needs to know that you are strong enough and you can do this, and that that person does not have control, and that you will find yourself in a better place, looking back on that time and thinking, wow, why didn't I make that change sooner? So anyways, guys, I hope you are doing well, and I really hope you are staying safe, and I just want you to know that I love you, and I will see you next time.